The shadows between the trees. The beginning that was never supposed to happen. One autumn evening, the sky was turning orange just before sunset, and the air had become colder than usual. Three men, friends for many years, gathered together. They had always loved adventures and trips, but this time felt different. The first was Salem, a brave man who loved entering places people avoided. If he heard a story about an abandoned place or a strange forest, he would always be the first to say, "Let's go and see." The second was Hyder, a very practical person who didn't believe in strange stories or superstitions. He always explained everything logically. The third was Mazen, the calmest of them all, and the one who noticed details the most. If he ever felt something unusual was there, he was rarely wrong. They sat near the car talking. Salem said while drinking water, "Have you heard about this forest?" Hyder raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Salem smiled. "People around here say that people get lost inside it." Hyder laughed. "Because they don't know directions." Mazen quietly said, "No, more than one person said they hear voices." Salem smiled wider. "That's exactly why we're going in." Hyder shook his head and laughed. "If we get lost, don't blame me." They prepared their flashlights, turned on location tracking, packed water and food, and entered. The first steps into the forest. At first, the place was beautiful. Very tall trees, ground covered with dry leaves. The air smelled of soil and moisture. Sunlight slipped through the branches in golden lines. Everything seemed normal. Salem walked ahead. Hyder filmed. Mazen walked behind them. After 10 minutes, they noticed something strange. The sounds started disappearing. No birds, no insects. Even the wind felt absent. Mazen said, "Isn't this strange?" Hyder replied, "What?" "There's no sound." They stopped. They listened. It was true. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Salem smiled. "Maybe because we've gone deeper." They continued. The first unexplainable thing about half an hour later. They were walking between the trees. Suddenly, Mazen stopped. Salem and Hyder walked a few steps before realizing he wasn't with them anymore. They turned around. He was standing still, staring between the trees. Salem asked, "What is it?" Mazen didn't answer. Hyder walked closer. "Mazen?" Slowly, Mazen raised his finger and pointed, far away. Between two tree trunks, something white stood there, like a person, but distant. Mazen quietly asked, "Can you see it?" Salem looked. Nothing. Hyder looked too. "Where?" Mazen pointed. "There, standing." They looked again. Nothing. Salem laughed. "That's just a tree." But Mazen kept staring. Then suddenly he said, "It disappeared." Hyder started making fun of him, but Mazen wasn't laughing. The feeling that someone was watching them, they continued walking. But after a while, Salem kept looking behind them. Hyder asked, "Why do you keep turning around?" Salem replied, "I feel like someone's walking behind us." Hyder laughed, but a minute later, they heard leaves moving. They turned quickly. No one. They continued. Again. Footsteps, this time clearer. They stopped. The sound stopped too. Hyder smiled. An animal. But Salem said nothing. The second illusion. They reached a place where the trees were much denser. The light became weaker. Salem suddenly stopped. He said, "Wait." He looked into the distance and saw a little girl, standing, her back facing them, between the trees. He whispered, "Did you see her?" Mazen turned. "See what?" Salem pointed. But when they looked, nothing. Hyder laughed loudly. "Now it's your turn." But Salem didn't laugh. He said, "She was there." The forest begins playing with them. Each of them started seeing different things. Mazen saw a man disappear. Salem saw people standing far away. Hyder saw movement between trees. But the problem, each person saw things alone. They started accusing each other. "You're imagining things." "No, you're trying to scare us." "Stop acting." The tension kept growing. Then something very strange happened. Each one began seeing the others. Salem saw Mazen standing far away, but the real Mazen was walking beside him. Salem turned quickly. The figure disappeared. He said nothing. Sunset. They reached a more open area. The sun started disappearing. Orange turned into red. The shadows grew longer. Mazen said, "We need to go back." They agreed. But before turning back, they heard something. A clear sound. Behind them, like someone walking slowly. Step, step, step. They turned. No one. But between the trees, something was standing there. This time, all three saw it. A very tall figure, its face unclear, standing completely still, watching them. Everyone went silent. For the first time, Hyder whispered, "What is that?" Salem switched his flashlight off and on. It disappeared. Then, from deep inside the forest, a very low voice came, as if from far away. "Why did you come in?" The men exchanged looks, and for the first time since the journey began, real fear started. To be continued. Part 2. When the ghosts took their faces. When the ghosts took their faces. The thing watching them did not want them to leave. After the men heard the strange voice coming from deep inside the forest, the three froze in place. The voice wasn't loud, and it wasn't frightening in the usual way. It was very calm, but there was something in it that made their bodies go cold. A voice that sounded as if it came from somewhere very close, and at the same time, very far away. "Why did you come in?" Salem looked at Hyder. Hyder looked at Mazen. None of them spoke. Then Hyder said while trying to laugh, "Someone's obviously joking." But even he didn't believe his own words. Salem quickly said, "We're going back." No one disagreed. The path that disappeared. They turned to go back, but all the trees looked identical. They couldn't tell where they had come from. Salem opened the map on his phone. It worked, but the location marker moved strangely. Once to the right, then to the left, then back to the same place. Mazen said, "Don't rush. Focus." They started walking, but after 10 minutes, they returned to the same tree. They recognized it because of an old knife mark on it. Hyder said, "Impossible." They changed direction, walked farther, returned again. This was when the real fear began. Salem said, "We're going in circles." Hyder replied nervously, "Don't say that." But inside, he had started feeling something wasn't normal. The first appearance of the copies. They decided to continue. A few minutes later, Salem was walking in front. Suddenly, he stopped, raised his hand. Mazen and Hyder stopped. Without turning around, Salem said, "Don't move," Hyder asked. "What?" Salem didn't answer. He pointed between the trees. They looked. At first, nothing. Then, someone stepped forward. They froze. It was Mazen. Same clothes, same hair, same posture, standing far away, watching them. But the real Mazen was standing beside them. Salem stepped back. Hyder stared between both of them. The real Mazen whispered, "That's not me." The second figure smiled, a long, unnatural smile, then walked into the trees and disappeared. Salem ran toward it. Nothing. He came back breathing heavily. Nobody spoke. The beginning of doubt after that. They started looking at each other differently. Salem watched Mason. Mason watched Hyder. Hyder started asking strange questions. Suddenly he asked, "Who was the first one that saw the white figure?" Mason replied, "Me." Hyder said, "Maybe since then, you haven't been you." Silence. It was meant as a joke, but nobody laughed. The ghosts began learning them as they walked. The copies became more accurate. This time, Hyder saw himself, standing between the trees. But the copy wasn't looking at him. It was looking at Salem, raising its hand, pointing at him. Hyder said, "Salem, don't turn." But Salem turned. It disappeared. Salem asked angrily, "What?" Hyder said, "I saw myself." Salem stayed silent. Things got worse. Each of them started seeing copies of themselves, but not only seeing, they started hearing. The voices at first. They heard simple things: footsteps, breathing, whispers. Then they began hearing each other's voices. Once, Salem heard Hyder say, "Don't trust Mason." But the real Hyder was far away. Once, Mason heard Salem calling him, but Salem never spoke. Once, Hyder heard someone laughing with his own voice. They turned around every minute. Fear turned into suspicion. The first confrontation. They reached a slightly open area, decided to rest. They sat, but Mason noticed something. He said, "Salem, when did your hand get dirty?" Salem looked. Mud covered his hand. He said, "I don't know." Mason replied, "It wasn't like that earlier." Then Hyder suddenly asked, "Salem, where did you go earlier?" Salem looked confused. "I didn't go anywhere." Hyder replied, "I saw you walking alone," Salem answered. "I never moved." Silence. Now they wondered, had they really been together the whole time? The copies began speaking. While standing there, they heard a voice, Salem's voice, but not from Salem. They turned. A person who looked exactly like Salem stood there, this time very close. He said, "Don't walk with them," then smiled and stayed silent. A second copy appeared, looking like Hyder. It said, "One of you isn't real," then disappeared. A third copy appeared, looking like Mason, but its face started changing, and it laughed. Slowly. Then it said, "If you can't tell who's real, how will you ever go home?" All their flashlights turned off at once. Darkness and running after seconds. The flashlights came back, but the copies had multiplied. 1, 2, 5, 10. Copies of the three men stood between the trees, all staring, some smiling, some crying, some pointing, some whispering. Then suddenly, all of them started walking toward the men. Salem screamed, "Run!" They ran with all their strength. They didn't look back. Many footsteps behind them, voices calling their names. Salem, Hyder, Mason. But they kept running. Then, ahead of them appeared a huge black opening among the rocks, a cave. They rushed inside, pulled stones behind them, and sat there breathing heavily. Outside the cave, the voices disappeared, but after a few minutes, they heard something. From inside the cave, footsteps, slowly coming closer, and they realized they had not escaped to a safe place. To be continued. Part 3. The Cave That Did Not Want Anyone to Leave. Part 3. The Cave That Did Not Want Anyone to Leave the place they entered to escape. Was not empty. The three men stood at the entrance of the cave, breathing heavily. Their hearts pounded fast. Their bodies were exhausted from running. Behind them was the forest. Ahead of them was darkness. They expected to feel relief after escaping, but the first thing they noticed was that the inside of the cave was unnaturally colder than outside. Not the cold of night air, a cold that reached into the chest. Salem stood and pointed his flashlight into the cave. Black stone walls, a high ceiling, and deep inside, a long tunnel with no visible end. Hyder tried calming himself. "Let's rest for a bit and leave." Mason kept staring inside. Quietly, he said, "I don't know why, but I feel like we entered the wrong place." Salem sat on a rock. Then suddenly, he noticed something. He said, "Do you hear that?" They became silent. At first, nothing. Then, from somewhere deep inside the cave, a sound, a water drop. Then minutes later, another drop. But strangely, the timing between them was perfectly equal. Not like water, like someone was making the sound. The first sign. Salem opened his bag, took out water, took a breath, then increased the flashlight brightness. He noticed the light becoming weaker. He said, "My battery was full." Hyder looked, his flashlight too. Mason's as well. 3 flashlights at the same time. Hyder said, "Impossible." They changed batteries. The lights became strong again. After 1 minute, they weakened again. Then suddenly, everything went dark. Complete darkness. They stayed silent. Then, the flashlights turned on by themselves, but this time, they were pointing deeper into the cave, and none of them was holding them. Salem jumped and grabbed his flashlight. They looked at each other. Nobody spoke. The thing walking with them. They decided not to go deeper, but they still felt uneasy. Salem said, "Let's move a little and find somewhere to sit." They walked carefully. Every step echoed. Step, step, step. But after some time, the echoes increased, like their footsteps became 4, then 5, then 6. They stopped. The sound disappeared. They walked. It returned. Mason said, "Don't move." They stopped. But the sound continued. Step, 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 then stopped. They looked at each other. Nobody breathed. Hyder whispered, "Someone's here." The changing tunnel. After minutes, they reached a narrow passage. They walked through it. After leaving, Salem turned around. The passage was gone. Now there was only a wall. He approached. No opening. He said, "Stop joking." Hyder touched the wall, solid stone. Mason said, "No, we came through here." They searched. Nothing. The way they entered had disappeared. Panic started. The first feeling that someone was very close, they sat down, decided to rest. Suddenly Salem felt something. A strange feeling, like someone was sitting with them. Not far, very close. He turned. Nobody. But the feeling stayed. Seconds later, Hyder said, "Do you feel it?" They looked up. Mazen immediately said, "Feels like someone's sitting with us." Silence. All 3 felt it, like there was a 4th person among them, but unseen. The voices begin copying them. They decided to talk to reduce fear. Salem said, "Once we get out, I'm never coming back." Suddenly, they heard the exact same sentence, from deep inside the cave, in Salem's voice, same tone. "Once we get out, I'm never coming back." Salem went silent. Hyder asked, "Did you say that?" "No." Then Mason said, "Don't talk." They sat. Then, a laugh. Hyder's laugh. But Hyder wasn't laughing. Then Mason's voice. Then Salem's. The voices copied them, always a few seconds later. The shadows that didn't match. They pointed flashlights at the wall. Their shadows appeared. 1, 2, 3. But after a few moments, a fourth shadow appeared. Everyone froze. They turned. Nobody. Looked again. The fourth shadow remained. Tall. Thinner. Its head tilted. Then it moved, while the men stood still and disappeared. Salem stepped back. The thing that touched them, they continued. While walking, Mazen suddenly stopped, turned quickly. He said, "Who touched my shoulder?" They replied, "Nobody." He swore he felt an ice-cold hand. Minutes later, Hyder stopped. He said, "Stop joking," Salem asked. "What?" Hyder said, "Something passed beside me." Then Salem himself felt it. Something moved past, without sound, but clearly. They started walking close together. The moment Salem broke, they reached a large open area inside the cave. Sat down. Salem raised his flashlight. Suddenly, he froze. He said, "Don't move." They looked, far away. Someone stood, back turned toward them. Hyder asked, "Who is that?" The figure slowly turned, very slowly, until the face appeared. It was Salem, but pale, with black eyes. It smiled, then vanished. Salem dropped to the ground, breathing fast. He said, "This isn't normal." The moment they remembered what they forgot, the three sat quietly. Nobody spoke. Suddenly, Mazen said, "All this time we've been trying to escape, trying to understand." He paused, then said, "But we forgot something." They looked at him. He said, "Since we entered, we never remembered God." He opened his phone, turned the volume up slightly, and began reciting the Quran softly. They sat with him, and while they recited, something strange happened. The cold air faded, the flashlights became stable, the echoes disappeared, and the feeling of the fourth presence started fading. But at the far end of the cave, before they left, they saw one last thing, a tall shadow, retreating into darkness, as if it had allowed them to leave, to be continued. Part 4. The Return. And did it really end? Part 4. The Return. And did it really end? The moment calm returned, but not completely. The three men sat inside the cave. No one looked at the other. No one wanted to talk about what they had seen. For the first time since entering, their flashlights stayed steady. The painfully cold air started becoming normal. Mazen quietly recited the Quran. Salem and Hyder repeated what they knew with him. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then more. Nothing happened. No sounds, no footsteps, no whispers. Even the feeling that a fourth presence was there disappeared. But despite that, none of them felt comfortable, because the silence inside the cave had become stranger than fear itself. Salem quietly said, "Do you feel it? Everything stopped suddenly?" Mazen stayed silent. Hyder said, "Like something was listening." Nobody replied. Leaving the cave, they stood up, decided to leave. This time they didn't run. They walked calmly. Strangely, the cave that had been changing before now looked normal. The passages returned. The paths made sense. No disappearing walls, no sounds. They reached the entrance, stopped, looked at the forest. It was the same forest. But somehow, it didn't feel like the same place. The air was normal. The trees moved. Even the insects had returned. Salem looked ahead and said, "Feels like everything became normal again." They walked toward the car. And then, something very strange happened. The road became shorter. The trip into the forest had taken hours, but the return took less than 30 minutes. They reached the car. The three stood there, silent, looking at each other. Hyder said, "Impossible. Salem replied, "Maybe we were just lost." But Mazen stayed quiet, opened the door, and got in. They drove away. The first unnatural thing after leaving night had begun to fall. Salem drove. Hyder sat in front. Mazen sat in the back. Nobody spoke. After a while, Mazen said, "Salem." "Yeah? What's that?" Salem looked in the mirror and stopped talking. Behind the car, between the trees, someone stood there, far away, but clearly visible, watching them. The car passed. It disappeared. Hyder quickly said, "Don't stop." They kept driving. A few minutes later, Salem looked again. Nothing. He laughed nervously and said, "Maybe I'm tired." But Mazen replied, "I saw it too." Silence. Returning home. They reached the city. Lights, people, cars, everything normal. And that was the strangest thing. How could 1 hour ago they had been somewhere that felt outside the world? And now everything looked ordinary? Hyder got out first. He said, "Nobody talks about this." Salem nodded. Mazen asked, "And if someone asks?" Hyder replied, "We say we got lost." Then left. Salem arrived home, went inside. His family welcomed him normally. He had dinner, sat quietly, tried to forget, but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the copies, the shadows, the voice, the cave. He decided to sleep. The first night Salem fell asleep. At midnight, he suddenly woke up, looked around. The room was quiet. He breathed, then noticed something. His bedroom door was open. He was sure he had closed it. He stood, closed it, returned, sat, then heard footsteps outside, stopped. Then a soft sound. Knock, knock, like someone tapping. He asked, "Who's there?" No answer. He opened the door. Nobody. Returned. And before closing it, he heard a whisper from the end of the hallway. "Why did you come in?" He shut the door quickly, turned on Quran recitation, and kept it playing until he slept. What happened to Hyder? The next day, Salem called Hyder. "How are you?" Hyder stayed quiet, then said, "Did anything happen to you?" Salem paused. "Why?" Hyder answered, "Last night I heard my own voice calling me." Silence. Hyder continued, "I went out. Nobody was there. And then I saw myself standing in the kitchen. But when I got closer, it disappeared." Silence again. And Mazen had something different. They visited Mazen. He opened the door. He looked exhausted. They entered, sat down. Salem noticed Quran recitation playing. He asked, "Since when?" Mazen replied, "Since I came back." Hyder asked, "Why?" Mazen stayed silent, then said, "Last night, I woke up and felt someone standing near the door. I opened my eyes and saw someone. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there. And when I turned on Quran, he disappeared." Silence. The final decision. After hours of talking, they agreed on one thing: never return, never mention the forest, never go anywhere similar. Days passed, then weeks. Things became normal. The nightmares disappeared. The voices stopped. Life continued. Months later, they met again. They laughed, talked, as if everything had ended. And while leaving, Mazen stopped, looked at Salem, and said, "You know what's the only thing that scares me?" Salem asked. "What?" Mazen said, "Are we sure that the ones who came back from the forest were really us?" Salem laughed, but Hyder didn't, because since the day they returned, he had one question he could never answer. Inside the cave, when there were 4 shadows, who was the 4th? The end. Silence. Hyder continued. I went out. Nobody was there. And then I saw myself standing in the kitchen. But when I got closer,